Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 dictatorships that are deadlier and crazier than North Korea. Number 10. Albania under Enver Hoxha. Even by the standards of your typical communist stooge, Enver Hoxha was something else. A hardcore Stalinist, he turned his back on Russia when Stalin's successor Khrushchev declared that maybe, just maybe, killing millions of innocent people hadn't been in the nation's best interests. For his over 4-decade reign, the nation was kept on a permanent nuclear war footing. Gigantic concrete bunkers were built all over the country. The borders were closed so no Albanians could leave on pain of death and no one could enter. Oh, and he also banned beards and opened gulags to liquidate people with facial hair. We're going to assume he just really hated hipsters. Number 9. Romania under Ceausescu. Hoxha may have been the craziest of the communists in Europe, but Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu was almost certainly the weirdest. One of his maddest acts was to construct the gigantic People's Palace in Bucharest, bulldozing most of the historic centre and flattening 2 mountains to provide stone for it. He built this monstrosity while malnutrition was increasing. Anyone deemed subversive could be disappeared or have their children taken away and raised in brutal orphanages that basically worked to starve children to death. Eventually, Romanians got so fed up with him that they launched a massive rebellion. Along with his wife, he was executed by firing squad on Christmas Day of 1989. Number 8. Myanmar under military dictatorship. As you watch this, Myanmar is undergoing a profound change. After over 5 decades of military dictatorship, the country is finally experimenting with democracy. For 50+ years, Myanmar was one of the nastiest, most repressive states in the world. Only a few years ago, ordinary Burmese were forbidden from traveling to other towns or villages without a passport and special permission. Brutal concentration camps sprang up across the country, with people detained in them for crimes such as telling jokes. Number 7. Equatorial Guinea under Francisco Macias Nguema. As someone who was extremely paranoid, Nguema was what you'd get if you asked a child to design a wacky dictator for a sitcom. Terrified of assassination, he refused to enter the capital of Malabo except in emergencies, preferring instead to live in a tiny hut with the national treasury hidden under his bed. This sort of sucked for those living in Malabo, as the electricity only got switched on when Nguema was in town. Nguema had a habit of hacking his enemies to death with machetes and feeding their remains to sharks, possibly in an attempt to land the title of real-life Bond villain. On the plus side, he did the decent thing and died in 1979, only 11 years after taking power. On the downside, his equally crazy nephew immediately took over. Number 6. Zaire under Mobutu Sese Seko. Sese Seko had one simple dream: to be the most corrupt leader in Africa and to look utterly pimptastic while doing so. Even as his citizens sank deeper into dire poverty, Seko blew the country's natural resources on stuff like a collection of ridiculous leopard skin hats he insisted on wearing at virtually all times. He was also utterly obsessed with wiping out any trace of colonialism from the country's past. Even citizens with European-sounding names were forced to adopt new, African-sounding ones. Cities, places, and concepts were likewise renamed, and all public sector workers were forced to dress in Chairman Mao-style depressing jackets. He was finally deposed in a coup in 1997, and his country was renamed. Number 5. The Central African Republic under Emperor Bokassa. When your international reputation is as the cannibal dictator, you know you're one bad dude. Meet that dude, Jean Bedel Bokassa, a self-styled emperor and a guy suspected of literally eating schoolchildren. During his 14-year reign, he kept a fleet of wild animals to throw his enemies to, and was rumored to have his political opponents cooked and served to visiting foreign dignitaries. When a magazine once did a shoot around his opulent palace, they accidentally photographed a fridge full of dismembered children. In 1976, Bokassa decided to become emperor and threw a lavish ceremony for himself, at which he paraded around in a ridiculous pimp hat. The ceremony cost his country's entire GDP, so no wonder they overthrew the guy 3 years later. Number 4. Togo under Ganassi B. Eyadema. Ganassabi Eyadema was one of the longest-serving dictators in Africa, having notched up an impressive 38 years. Over the course of his reign, Eyadema amassed ridiculous plaudits like they were going out of fashion. He surrounded himself with 1,000 dancing women who followed him around, singing his praises. Radio stations were required to start every announcement with a jingle declaring that he'd been appointed by God. Incredibly, Eyadema's reign isn't something from the distant past. He was still head of state in 2005 when he finally had the decency to die of a heart attack. Number 3. Nigeria's endless coups. Nigeria has suffered so many coups that it's basically pointless to single out any one of them as especially bad. The vast majority of them outright sucked, while a handful were more benign. However, it's the sheer number that fulfill the craziness quota, making it seem at times like overthrowing the government was once the national Nigerian sport. In some instances, new governments would last less than a week before being ousted again. Thankfully, by 1999, the country was all couped out, and today Nigeria is a democratic nation. Number 2. Yemen under Ali Abdullah Saleh. The Middle East isn't exactly known as a bastion of democracy, so it can seem kind of unfair to single out one dictator amongst all the others, until that is you start reading about Yemen's former ruler, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Not content with being a despot and acting like a dick, he decided to do something so crazy even Kim Jong-un wouldn't contemplate it. He deliberately seceded a large chunk of Yemeni territory to Al-Qaeda. So why did Saleh hand them an enormous slice of strategic territory? The answer is as simple as it is Machiavellian. At this time, pro-democracy protests were shaking Yemen. After seeing what had happened to people like Egypt's Mubarak in the Arab Spring, Saleh decided he needed the West on his side. So he convinced Western governments the protests were organized by Al-Qaeda by letting the terror group run wild. Number 1. Belarus under Lukashenko. It seems hard to believe a dictatorship such as Alexander Lukashenko's ever existed, let alone in Europe. A brutal regime that executed random people to keep the population on their toes, assassinated the wives of political opponents, banned theatre groups and the local language, and even once bombed its own population to whip up public fear of terrorists. Know what's even less believable? It still exists today. Under Lukashenko, the secret police is so powerful that they routinely visit people every single night, and possibly several times every single night, depriving them of sleep and leaving them in a constant state of paranoia. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do click that like button below and don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you really like this channel, you might not know that I have a couple of other channels over there on the right. The top one is Today I Found Out, which is where we do kind of a longer form look into certain specific subjects. So click there to check that one out. And below that is my personal vlog, where I vlog about my life every day, about being a YouTube creator. So be sure to check those out, and thanks for watching.